Hello, everybody. I'm Norma Levy, New Plus's president, and we are a not-for-profit organization, a community for film lovers. Today, Gary Palmucci, our curator, has chosen the great 1961 film by that seminal Japanese filmmaker, Akira Korosawa. It's called Yojimbo. It's a fabulous film. The discussion will be led by Gary and by our wonderful film historian, Max Alvarez. So thank you all for coming. And Gary, please begin.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Norma. Thanks for joining us on this beautiful afternoon to celebrate one of Akira Kurosawa's most popular and I think most cinematically accomplished films, Yojimbo, along with its incomparable star, Toshiro Mifune. Now, as many times as I've seen it over the years, I discovered this week some new aspects of Yojimbo, including the correct pronunciation of the title. Thanks once again to our friends at the Criterion Collection and the commentary track by Japanese film historian Stephen Prince, who referred to it as a film of blood and ideas, which I think is very appropriate, as we'll see. Now, Max, the trailer that you unearthed here today is very special in that it contains, I think, at least 3 scenes that were shot especially for the trailer, either using alternate takes or something very specific for the trailer, alternate takes of crucial moments in the film.
Yes, Gary, this is going to be the trailer that would have been shown in Japanese cinemas. It appears a week before Yojimbo was originally released some 60 years ago. And if I had to guess, the initial shot we see of the 2 lead actors looks to me like a wardrobe test, because they're not on location, they're not on a set, they seem to be in a room somewhere in a studio. And then you will see, you're not imagining things, because the standoff between the 2 that we see at the end of the trailer is not from the film. In the film, there are lots of men behind them, but in the trailer, it's just the 2 lead actors. And so that was clearly produced for salesmanship purposes to release the film. And what is fascinating is they're selling this as a vehicle for the 2 stars. Mifune, of course, was internationally known well over a decade, but Tatsuya Nakadai, the gunman, was a pretty recent international star thanks to a film he made called The Human Condition. So they're playing up these two major actors appearing together for the first time. And I wish we could hear it in original Prospecta stereophonic sound, but here is how Toho Studios sold Yojimbo.
俺を買わんか。用心棒にどうだ。腕は今見せる。ああ、面白いもん見せてるか。
地獄の入り口で顔を合わせたこの2人。
このざまだ。だから言わねえこっちゃねえ。6人ぐらいじゃ手不足だ。ところであの6人、とてもうまく料理されてたな。あんないい腕を持ったやつはこの近くにはお前しかいねえ。 それでもしかするとあの6人叩き殺したのはおめえじゃねえかと思ってね。
刀かピストルか宿命の対決。
あんまりこっちに来るんじゃねえ。
Opens next week. I mean, that gives you a sense of the efficiency of theatrical distribution in Japan at that time.
Well, I think also the fact that Korosawa was well known for being able to put together, a fine cut of his films within a week or two after shooting was finished. As a rule, with the exception of something like Seven Samurai, was dragged on, for over a year in production. But as you said, that opening shot almost looked like in the middle of a wardrobe test. Somebody had the idea to have the actors kind of menacingly, circle each other or something as a little piece of marketing, and it turned out to be a good one. And then we see in that scene where we see the aftermath of Mifune having destroyed the shack with the 6 samurai bodyguards, and then walking back in trying to fool the gangsters. That's kind of a B camera shot there, a little bit tighter than what we saw in the film. And then, as you said, the showdown at the end, the other 10 samurai were in wardrobe or something. They weren't there at that time. It's a very different climax.
They were clearly playing up the star power in the film. And what you're describing, Gary, it's typical of the fact that Kurosawa oftentimes used multiple cameras. And I know that our special guest, Dan Cahill, is going to talk more about that when he discusses the look of Yojimbo. But even not just in battle scenes, but even in very intimate scenes with a few actors in an interior, it was not unknown for Kurosawa to use several cameras at the same time. He might just choose one take, but he liked having those options. And you picked up on the fact that this may have been an alternate take from that scene. And I am surprised at how quickly the editing came into place. I remember he was interviewed on that subject. I mean, consider the intricate nature of the content. The fact that they were able to move quickly on the editing is impressive, because his films never give the impression that they were hastily put together at all.
Not at all. And this is kind of I suspect Dan Cahill is going to get into this in his presentation, kind of a celebration of the telephoto lens, which I found myself realizing I knew less about than I thought in terms of the description in this film, the incredible focal lengths of some of the lenses that were used. Now, in your talks about cinematography, I think you've delved into the telephoto lens a little bit, maybe for those of our viewers who are less familiar, and that sort of very unusual way in which those lenses are employed on a set, sometimes 50 yards away from the action to create the director's intended effect.
And I know Dan will talk more about that, but just the nuts and bolts description for me is, just imagine you're looking through a pair of binoculars. The telephoto lens does exactly what a binoculars or a telescope does. It just brings the action closer to us, compresses everything. The depth of field is lost, but it enables you to get closer to the action from a distance. And as you say, it's a celebration of the telephoto lens, but also of the widescreen Toho scope format that Dan's going to explain how that works. But Toho scope basically was a Japanese answer to CinemaScope. And Kurosawa is going to be using that at least from 1958 for a number of years, starting with The Hidden Fortress, making sure every inch of the frame is either filled or composed magnificently.
It was a period of time, Max, I think, when he was shooting, and I think all the Japanese studios, the 4 major ones, they were shooting all their pictures in some scope ratio or another, just as 20th Century Fox was, and some of the American studios.
Absolutely, because I know in Hong Kong, the Shaw Brothers studio they had Shaw Scope. Something, it was licensed out internationally, and people put their own names on it. But I don't envy Daniel's task today, because to have to single out to have to single out specific scenes in Yojimbo for their composition, I mean, how do you limit it? Because it seems like every single camera angle is a masterpiece of composition and lighting and cinematic artistry.
Yes, indeed.
And so this is, it's part of the samurai movement that Kurosawa had been involved with, as well as other directors. But his participation is starting to wind down. Yojimbo was a tremendous success in 1961, and many who know their westerns and their gangster pictures will know that it influenced at least 2 films. 3 years later, there was the unauthorized Sergio Leone Western remake, which was A Fistful of Dollars.
An Italian industry specialty, the unauthorized remake.
Exactly. And then in the 90s, in 96, there was the authorized Walter Hill remake, Last Man Standing, which was translating the action to 1930s gangland. It was more stylish than artistic. But the tremendous success of Yojimbo in Japan resulted in an immediate sequel, Sanjuro, the following year. And then Kurosawa is going to go in a whole different direction. A lot of it is economically determined by the decline in the Japanese film industry, but it's also as a result of what he felt were, I think, public and filmmaking misperceptions about the uses of violence in these films. And I don't want to get us too off track, but Sanjuro, the following year, was known for a very famous bloodletting scene that Kurosawa saw as an experiment, but that other filmmakers thought, hey, this is great. We can now be more explicit with violence. And Yojimbo was one of the early films to incorporate more dark humor with violence that, of course, films of the 1960s are going to take off and run with. And Kurosawa is going to get away from that very shortly.
It's hard to, put it in context sometimes today, but things like, as Mifune makes his entrance into the town, when the dog comes along with the severed hand, that was considered shocking at that time, that things like that just weren't shown in films, or those quick killings of the hapless samurai at the beginning, and the sound effects, which were, more pronounced than people were used to hearing.
And this, of course, the severed arm, which began with the constable saying to Sanjuro, chop off one of their arms and then they'll behave. So here it was played for humor, but then in 1985 when he made Ron, and there's that brilliant montage of a battle sequence that has no sound effects, you see someone with a severed arm, but it's not played for laughs. So Kurosawa, that reflects his change in his how he was portraying violence and bloodshed. But there are just so many great lines in the film. We'll talk more about Itsuzu Yamada, who played the mother. At one point, she says to her idiot son, "Whether you kill 1 or 100, you only hang once." And then there was a great line after Sanjuro has taken that horrible beating from the giant. He says to the old man, "I know I'm quite a sight, but could you do your staring later?" These are just eternally funny lines amidst all this anxiety and tension.
Well, and I love Mifune's introduction in the film too, as the Criterion commentators, we see him taking a look at some imposing Japanese mountain and looking very imposing himself, and he says, well, there's a mountain and a mountain of a man, and then we see him, being one of these penniless, masterless adrift samurai, simply throwing a forked stick up in the air, and wherever it lands, that's the direction in which he starts walking.
And then, of course, there's the wonderful bit of business, and I don't know whether Mifune came up with this or whether Kurosawa wanted him to, but it's the shoulder twitch that you see even at the most intense moments. He never loses that twitch. It's just an extraordinary character element in developing character.
The constant language with that toothpick or whatever it is he has in his mouth there that's constantly in motion, also in any scenes.
And his character, Sanjuro, I mean, the Clint Eastwood character in Fistful of Dollars was known as the man with no name. I mean, technically, Mifune is the samurai with no name. He doesn't arrive in town with a name. He gets a name after seeing a field, and basically takes the name takes the name of the field, the Mulberry Field. And so that becomes his name. And this idea that he's pitting these two rival factions against each other, is it a metaphor? I mean, it has been seen as a metaphor. You mentioned the Kurosawa scholar Stephen Prince, when he wrote in his book, The Warrior's Camera, he wrote, in its fantasy gratifications, Yojimbo may be read as an allegory about Kurosawa's own notorious and well-documented confrontations with studio executives and marketing representatives. Mm-hmm. I would argue that given Kurosawa's radical political roots, that it could be seen as a comment on predatory capitalism. I mean, you've got the sake merchant and his thugs on one side, and you have the silk merchant and his thugs on the other side, taking advantage of everybody. And there is
both. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add, there was that great line: "You can't build a fortune unless you're known as a killer and a thief." But go ahead, Gary.
Well, and these merchants are sort of under the control of the local gangsters, and they're even referred to in this mid 19th century context by a phrase we've come to know better, yakuza, which is now applied to the more modern Japanese gangster, but apparently it's still a relevant term in those days. And as our commentator explains, yakuza is a Japanese word that literally means the numbers 893, which is the worst hand that one could have in a very popular Japanese card game. And then these yakuza were sort of like outcasts, or kind of the lowest of the low in some ways in the society, both then and in the 20th century.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. They don't have a date where the story is set, but one account I read placed it around 1860, which is the end of the Edo era, to signify the point of exhaustion in both the Japanese feudal system and in the system of hierarchy. And I'm quoting here, that had elevated the samurai above farmers, merchants, and other workers. So once again, there's definitely a political.
Well, I think you're right, and I maybe would even place it a few years later, because I think repeating pistols, and maybe somebody will correct us on this point who's even more knowledgeable, but I think repeating pistols were relatively rare until around maybe the mid 1860s or 1870. Like repeating rifles, even in the American Civil War, were very rare, and I think. This pistol might have come from some European traveler to Japan, which was ahead of the United States in the manufacture of versus the single shot pistol, where this is and of course Nakadai seems to have an unlimited supply of ammunition in the film as well.
Well, for me, it was a bit shocking to see Nakadai in such a slimy role, because I knew him from these very heroic character he played in a legendary Kobayashi film that ran 9 hours called The Human Condition. And then, of course, he plays this Henry Fonda type police detective in Kurosawa's High and Low. He's a nice guy. But he also had played some villains in a number of samurai films of the 60s. And he was associated at this time with director Kobayashi, who also directed him in Kwaidan and Harakiri and other films of that era.
That's a classic, Harakiri, which he's the lead.
Right, and in 2008, Tatsuya Nakadai came to New York City. He was a guest at Film Forum, where he was interviewed by the Kurosawa scholar Mike Jeck, and he talked about his work with Kurosawa, and it was a very entertaining and it was very exciting to actually see him. But this was the first time that he was opposite Mifune, who has just a couple of films to go with Kurosawa. He's already made at least more than a dozen films with Kurosawa since 1948. But they're starting to wind down that.
Well, they had a falling out on a picture in 1965, Redbeard, another attempt at an epic. Which I found, maybe I should give it another chance, but I found that one of Kurosawa's weakest and most sort of protracted and indulgent films, and it was on that film apparently that he and Mifune had a falling out, which has never really been completely articulated, at least to Westerners, why and how that came about, to me at least.
The closest I've gotten to it is the fact that it didn't help that Redbeard apparently was in production for 2 years. And during that time, Mifune had to turn down other jobs. And he was just, as anyone would have, was going crazy by the time production had wound down. And Redbeard, I mean, it's basically an intimate medical story, but it is blown out of, it's an over 3-hour picture. And I remember it has extraordinary things in it, but it probably requires a second look. But this just shows the tremendous range that Mifune demonstrated under Korosawa during the 16 film collaboration that they had.
Yeah, it is remarkable. It's one of the great bodies of work between an actor and director.
And there are some other actors worthy of mention here. There is, I consider him a comic actor. I would say Daisuke Kato, who played that very heavy-set villain who was always biting his lower lip. And you will see him in Rashomon. You will see him as a scarred gangster in Ikiru by Kurosawa, and you'll also see him in Seven Samurai. And you'll also see him in some 235 other Japanese films that were made during his career.
Is he the one who's learning to count as we see the film? Yeah,
he's the one who's learning to count, and he's a scene stealer. And then I mean, I had mentioned the other day when we talked about Kurosawa, unlike his other filmmaking contemporaries, was not known, at least early through most of his career, making films with a lot of female characters or giving a lot of roles to actresses. Let's say compared to Naruse or Ozu. But when he did come up with a role for an actress, it was pretty memorable. Isuzu Yamada, who plays the very calculating mother here, who wants to have Mifune killed after he does some work for them. She had an even more memorable role a few years earlier as the Lady Macbeth type wife of Mifune in Throne of Blood.
Yes.
So, and she's also, I think you mentioned she was also in The Lower Depths, where she played the landlady.
That's right.
You know,
that's a Kurosawa that I revisited recently. Well, you know, Dan was kind of holding back his visuals from us this week. Maybe it's time for him to unveil it now.
I think it is. Dan Cahill, we know him from our participating discussions here in New Plaza Cinema. He's a film instructor. He's been in film production. And not only is he going to tell us about the visual look of Yojimbo, but Dan, remind me, I'll also have questions for you about Masaru Sato's score for the film. But welcome, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on the look of Yojimbo.
Yes, good afternoon. And I want to say at the outset that my principal theme here in discussing the look of the film will be how Kurosawa, in an exemplary way, exploits the widescreen frame. And one way I'm going to begin is with one of the slides that I showed when we discussed Klute about 2 months ago, that being the other time when we had a widescreen film in this same aspect ratio. So here is that aforementioned slide. The previous standard film frame was the 4:3 aspect ratio shown in the top row, second from the left. That was standard for television and most films made up until the 50s. What we're going to see today is 2:35, or as it says here, 2.39:1. Cinematic widescreen in the middle row on the far right. So that is the kind of shape of the frame that we're dealing with here. And Kurosawa really knew how to use it. Here is one of the first examples. This, of course, is the first shot in the film. And I think it's interesting that we see Sanjuro, our protagonist, from the back. We never see his face for the first 2 or 3 minutes during the credits. And this is emblematic of a man of mystery. We never learn exactly where he comes from. All he seems to have with him is his sword. He doesn't even have a backpack or a fanny pack or any other belongings. Just his sword is all he has with him. This, as Gary mentioned, is one of the haunting, creepy shots in the film. And it's meant to depict ordinary daily life in this corrupt, hideous town. And one of the things that makes it especially creepy is the sort of casual, matter-of-fact, everyday air that it has to it. There is nothing sensationalized in this because it doesn't need it. the basic content of the shot is a dog carrying a severed hand. And we see at the conclusion of the shot, we see Sanjuro react with, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? So that's one of the more effective shots in the film. Here we see an early scene in the film where Sanjuro is talking with his friend who runs this shop. And one feature of the film is the use of background detail. Here, it's not really an active part of the story, but it's sort of setting the template for how Korosawa will use these frames within a frame. This store has a lot of sliding panels in it, and the owner of the store is able to slide them back and forth to show what we need to see to advance the narrative. This is one example of how it's used, where we see three people connected in a dialogue scene. Sanjuro in the middle, in the dark virtually, is listening to a dialogue scene between the man on the left and the two men on the right. And they even very cleverly use lighting to distinguish the three men from each other. The man on the left is sort of mid-range, and the guys on the right are in what appears to be daylight. This is a fascinating shot. This is not so much typical of Korosawa in this film, but it becomes sort of a trademark for the aforementioned Sergio Leone, who did a lot of very tight close-ups of people, also in widescreen. And this really brings you into the moment. There's no getting away from these characters and the feelings and thoughts that they're sharing with each other. This is a favorite shot of mine in the film, and it shows Sanjuro, as some people have said, in his stand-in role as Korosawa, the film director. What he does is he creates conflict, sets people in motion against each other, and then climbs up to the top of a tower. Let's imagine that being a crane, and watching with great pleasure what he has just created. So there are several shots like this in the film. Here is another one of the same scene featuring Sanjuro surveying what he has created with the two lead gangsters having a showdown between themselves. This is just an interesting, more technical point of view on cinematography, and the fact that the scene apparently, from the way the foreground is lit, takes place sort of in twilight. But the interesting thing is the way the windows in the background were used to set off the background as being different, very far away and different from the foreground. This is another example probably of a telephoto lens, which brings you closer to the characters, but farther away from the background because the depth of field is so shallow. This is another favorite sequence where we watch Mifune in all of his athleticism at age 40 or so, I believe, tearing apart this one room, all in one long take. And this, I believe, is an example of Korosawa choosing the long lens take out of what was probably a multiple camera setup, because he liked the way the action looked when framed with a telephoto lens. He liked the way it was compressed in with the background. And it's certainly a very dynamic scene, as is this one, which is the flood in the sake warehouse. And this is just interesting to note how the technique is very different. In the previous shot, if I can go back to that, the camera moves around with Mifune as he's moving around in this room, constantly reframing the action, which requires a very skilled operator. Here, everything is one static camera position, and Korosawa has beautifully choreographed all of the action. The effect of the sake flood is just startling and, like most of the film, visually unforgettable. Here's another example of Korosawa composing a shot with, in this case, I think 4 different planes. The closest to us, slightly out of focus, is the giant who carries the hammer around. And then next to him, slightly further back, is the man he's conversing with. Then we see the dangling legs of Sanjuro's friend, who is not literally being hanged, but he is being suspended over the street. And in the far distance, we see 2 people getting ready for the final showdown. This is another famous shot, I think, it's an example of how Kurosawa could have played this very differently, but he kept the whole tableau of this final scene in one take. And it is an interesting tableau. Unosuke, the evil guy with the pistol, has been asking Sanjuro to hand him back the pistol so he can die with it in his hand. And the audience is thinking, is it really empty as he said it was? Turns out not to have been, but it's interesting that Kurosawa doesn't feel any need to show you a close-up of the pistol as Sanjuro glances at it before he hands it to him. He trusts us to watch the scene unfold as it should. And here we are at the end of the film with Sanjuro departing the movie the way he entered, with his back to the camera, still very much a man of mystery. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and I would like to hand it off to you guys with one interesting comment that yesterday I watched for the first time in many decades, A Fistful of Dollars. Mm-hmm. And it was described in the Criterion booklet as an almost shot-for-shot remake of Yojimbo. No, not even close.
No.
The visuals are extremely different. It's in color, first of all, and the shots are composed very differently. Leone was a master filmmaker himself, or he would soon evolve into it. And he didn't need to copy Kurosawa. He had his own talent, and it was coming through early on in his career. So I'll toss that thought to you guys.
Well, some aspects of the plot are similar, and the whole business of
it's definitely a remake. It's the same story. Many of the characters are the same. Go ahead, please.
And the coffin maker who keeps turning up, and he's at some point getting a little flustered because this is cutting into his business, and he has to make so many coffins, and charges less for them. And of course, Eastwood is beaten up and has to lie low for a certain period of time before he resuscitates himself. But no, not a shot-for-shot remake by any means. But you can imagine why they weren't happy at the Toho Corporation, which is a very conservative, buttoned-up company, and remains so well into the 70s and 80s, as I recall, from some of its film distribution practices.
Well, Daniel, that was an outstanding part one of what I hope will be 300 in terms of analyzing Yojimbo, because there's just every shot is really something to see. And you had mentioned how you were so impressed with the background action. I made a note of the scene where Sanjuro is watching the Ito inspectors through the ward or the board. Either there's wood or a wall, and you see the Ito inspectors. Once again, any other director would have cut to a closer view of those inspectors, but Kurosawa didn't do that. He let us see them through the slats in the wall.
And what we were seeing through those slats was the inspectors being bribed by the locals. So, it's very important stuff, but it's there in the background, and you don't have to watch it close up to know what's going on.
And there was one other thing I wanted to mention about the photography. You mentioned, of course, all the telephoto lenses that were used. There are a couple of cases of what we call deep focus, where the foreground and the background were in focus in some interior scenes. And the scene I'm thinking of is when Sanjuro is learning about the woman who was kidnapped and held as a prostitute by one of the rulers, and her husband is in the center of the frame weeping as Sanjuro is being told the story by a third man. And you have these three men very carefully positioned in the shot, and the man in the foreground is in focus, the men in the background and the wall are as well. And that's a very simple but very beautiful piece of composition, I would just add.
Probably not done with the telephoto lens, because it would have been hard to keep that space all in focus. That, or they unleashed a ton of light on it so that they could stop down the lens to a very small aperture. But I'm already getting a bit too technical for most of our viewers.
Well, definitely it would be a step, probably more, you're right, a non-telephoto lens. Daniel, can you comment on the score by Masato Sato? I just thought it was fantastic. And you had mentioned there's a baritone sax in there, but there's all kinds of percussion instruments. And people sometimes complained about the westernized scores that Kurosawa used. This has a very Japanese sound to it, but it's just really a magnificent score.
Yeah, it's It is, it's, the instrumentation is very Western. I don't detect anything that sounds uniquely Japanese. It may be there and my ears are not attuned to it, but it's worth noting that this film, I believe, has more music per running time than any other Kurosawa film. And he sort of lavished it on the film. One director I knew referred to it as sort of pouring ketchup all over the film, but it's there and it does keep you gripped. You know, it's undeniably an attention getter. And sometimes I think they go a little over the top with it, but it seems appropriate to the story.
His scores can be very, he's kind of the Bernard Herrmann to Kurosawa's Hitchcock. They can be very, very tense and very gripping. They had 9 collaborations together they were involved in I Live in Fear, Throne of Blood, The Lower Depths, Hidden Fortress, The Bad Sleep Well, which was a year before, Sanjuro, which was a year after, High and Low, the wonderful detective picture, and then finally Redbeard. And so clearly that was a collaboration that, but each score was a little different. It had its own personality. And I think that speaks volumes about the composer. Although the cinematographer Katsuyo Miyagawa, this was only one of 2 films he shot for Kurosawa. He made Rashomon, and then there were no other films other than this one. And Gary, you felt that there was a studio reason for that.
Well, I think that at that particular time in the 50s, there was a rigidity in the employment ranks where cameramen who worked for a certain studio typically were either compelled or chose to stay with that studio. In the case of Miyagawa, Daiei versus Toho, where Kurosawa worked for much of the 50s and 60s. But then I think Daiei started to fall on hard times there in the late 50s, and Miyagawa was available to work for other studios and for other directors. And that's how he got connected on Yojimbo. And Daniel, getting back to the score for a second, you referenced the other day an interesting an American saxophone player who was in his heyday at the time that Yojimbo was made, Jerry Mulligan, who
yes,
you could be quoting a little bit there in that wonderful baritone sax bit.
In fact, a bit of minutia here. I happened to be watching a heist film called The Hot Rock with Robert Redford.
Remember,
this was
Afghanistan, Bananistan.
Yes, wow. This film was scored by Quincy Jones, and interestingly enough, the credits at the end listed the major musicians in that band, which included Jerry Mulligan, Clark Terry, and Ray Brown, all of them giants in the jazz industry. Mm-hmm. And you never saw individual musicians get credited. But Jerry Mulligan also had a role in I think we talked about this, in the soundtrack of I Want to Live.
Yes, when we talked about jazz and blues, there was
yeah.
There, and I don't want to get us. This is really important.
It's off the track, I know.
No, but it does tie into the brilliant score, which does have some jazzy elements to it. I think
of course, yeah.
You know,
it's hard to play a baritone sax and make it sound orchestral or classical. It's just there going oompa right in your face.
Because it didn't seem too out of period. It seemed to flow very well with the 19th century setting. And I'm known for commenting on subtle uses of sound in movies. I don't think sound recording gets enough attention, but for Kurosawa, the other day I mentioned one of my favorite uses of sound was in Throne of Blood, where the Lady Macbeth character was walking across the wood floors with her robe and her slippers. You can hear the robe and the slippers against the wood. Here, I loved it when Sanjuro, after he's been brutally beaten, he's crawling under one of a building, and you can hear the feet of men going on the wood above him. This clamoring of feet. It's just an effective use of sound that I just think is well done.
Yes, of course. I don't know, I don't know enough Kurosawa films to know if this is a typical signature sound effect use with him for dramatic purposes. Do you think this is a frequent thing he did?
From it, now that I'm thinking about it, I'll just say that there were experimental or very inventive uses of sound in a lot of his work, and I would have to revisit them to really notice them more. But the point is, we're not supposed to notice these things as we're watching the film itself.
Right. Some are, I would say, some are subtle, some are dramatic. As some of our viewers may recall, the famous scene in Ron, where there was the attack on the king's castle, which is played silently until one particular point in the battle scene, where suddenly one of the key players generals is shot in the back from behind on a horse, and that gunshot comes in, and then the sound, just chaos and panic and pandemonium ensues, and that's a one of his classic not subtle but very effective transitions. Definitely. And there's an actor who's worth mentioning, because he's almost a blink and you'll miss appearance, and that's Takashi Shimura, who plays one of he plays the sake brewer in the film, and he doesn't have a lot of scenes in this picture, but he was a staple in Kurosawa's films. They worked together on so many films going back to the late 40s. I had mentioned the other day that I considered his transition from the dying bureaucrat in Ikiru in 1952 to the samurai leader 2 years later in Seven Samurai, one of the greatest ranges I've ever seen in a film actor. And we see him here in High and Low and The Bad Sleep Well and other films, but just an extraordinary actor who had a stage background, came from stage training. But Kurosawa had his staple of talent that dual icons, I would say, really, that he was fortunate to have in his the height of his creativity. Yeah, and it's frustrating when you see this, because it's kind of ushering in the declining economic years in the Japanese film industry, which by the mid to late 50s, there's going to be a serious decline from this extraordinary post-World War II era. That brought Kurosawa and other giants to the forefront of international film going. You think we should hear what some of our guests have to say?
Bring them on.
I see a lineup here. Let's
good. We're going to take some questions from people and some thoughts. Before we do, I just want to do a little reminder, and I know that Sean is going to tell us more, that there's going to be a science fiction film lecture in a couple of weeks. Sean's going to tell us all about that. And then on the 21st, my film craft course for New Plaza Cinema, which I presume everyone can see now, is going to be resuming with a class on the technique of screen acting. It's not how to act in the movies, but it's the technology that goes into creating a film performance, either that actors themselves have to learn, or sometimes the people behind the scenes are part of, whether it's enhancing a performance through editing, or sometimes damaging a performance through editing, coordinating the actor with the camera. We'll see a Marlon Brando screen test. We'll see some other examples of this craft. And then, as you can see, every month, the third Tuesday, we'll be dealing with a different discipline behind the scenes. You can still get in on a good rate for the entire course, and I know Sean will tell us some more about that. But I hope to see you on the 21st for part 2 of Filmcraft. And Lori, you can assist us with any questions or thoughts that our audience members have with us today.
Yes. First up is Karen Davis. Karen, could you please unmute yourself and start your audio or your video?
Sure. I was just wondering who was responsible for the rolling shoulder walk that Mifune uses. Was it from Mifune or was it Kurosawa? Because that walk is just so memorable.
That was a question I was wondering myself today. I'm sure there's an answer there somewhere. I don't know if, or Gary or Daniel, if you came across an interview where they mentioned that wonderful bit of business, but I don't recall finding out where it originated from.
Not specifically that I know of.
I do have a thought to share. A friend of mine who knows the film very well said he had heard or read that it was trying to communicate the fact that Sanjuro had fleas. That's all I know, but it's It's believable if it's a guy who sleeps outside most of the time.
It is very believable because in there's one famous samurai novel I read where, personal hygiene was a very urgent topic for samurai who were wandering all over the countryside and various temperatures and times of year and torrential rains, which of course in every Kurosawa picture, including this one, we see a torrential rainfall.
If I could just make a stab at that as well. At the very beginning, when he drops that stick, his entrance into the film and out of the film is very Chaplin-esque. And maybe, how Chaplin sort of has that like twitch, and he kind of also uses his sword almost like Chaplin uses his cane throughout. I just kept thinking him a little bit Chaplin-esque throughout the movie. I don't know if that was anyone else's thought, but that would be my, no pun intended, stab at it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's as outrageous as it sounds. Seriously, I mean, Kurosawa would have been like a generation of moviegoers and is really inspired by Chaplin's work.
Absolutely.
I love that analogy. That's great.
All right. Thank you,
Karen.
Lou Brothers, if you could unmute yourself and start your video. Hi, Lou.
Yes, hello.
I want to say if anyone else has questions, please raise your hand. I don't see any right now. So please raise your hand just in the reaction button. Thank you. Go ahead, Lou.
I just wanted to comment on the use of wind and dust in most of the outdoor scenes. I had a very different reaction when I saw the opening shot.
Oh, we need your sound, Lou. We lost your sound.
Sorry, Lou. That was mine. My fault. I thought I was with someone else.
So we're going to have you repeat let's see. We're going to ask Lou to unmute himself.
Lou, can you unmute yourself? Sorry about that.
There we go.
If you could
repeat. That's your last name.
Yes. When I saw the first scene, I had a very different reaction. I looked at that and I thought, this is a Western. John Ford could have filmed this. And I feel the same way about the ending shot. And it was because of that use of wind and dust, which came through most of the outdoor scenes.
Well, I want to chime in and say, Lou is the friend of mine who told me about the fleas. It's worth
Actually,
noting.
that's a comment in the Criterion edition.
Busted.
Okay.
No, that is from the Criterion edition. There's a comment in there about why the shoulder roll occurred.
Well, that's great. And Lou, I think your analogy to Ford is a very sensible one, because Ford was another director whose work Kurosawa had seen many of his films by the late 1920s. So Kurosawa was a great admirer of Ford. I'm not sure how Ford felt about Kurosawa's work, but clearly he would have been inspired by the Ford Westerns. And you can see how this influenced Westerns itself after it came out.
In fact, I had a frame I was going to use if I'd had the time, showing how the villain with the pistol, Unosuke, is introduced in a cloud of wind and dust. That's how he comes into the film. So it's used for very dramatic effect.
And just so everyone knows, when you do a motion picture, they use a very special kind of dirt. It's called Fuller's Earth. It doesn't react like normal dirt. It's more cinematic. So just so you know, little inside trick.
I never knew that. That's fantastic.
Yes. On the DVD of the film,
same thing in Western movies.
On the DVD of the film, they explain that in this particular case, they got several truckloads of dust from a defunct Japanese wartime firing range that was used for that same purpose.
So dust may have been a lot more unpleasant for the actors than it would have been maybe in a Hollywood production.
I would suspect, yeah.
March 26th, if you could unmute your mic and start your video. I promise not to mute you. There we go. Hi,
Can you
you want to start your video?
I try. I don't know why it's not working.
Let's see. Well, we can.
I sent you a request to start.
Okay, there we go. You had me all locked down there. How you guys doing?
Hi there.
Thank you for doing this. I'm actually in Los Angeles, and a friend of mine told me, oh, it's 1 p.m. here, because over there it's 4 4 p.m. I was like, oh, I almost missed it. So I'm glad
I got from the West Coast.
Yeah. I love this director. He's probably my favorite director. One thing I noticed I just wanted to mention, especially with this movie, he gets these really long takes where there's so many shots in one shot, in one take. Like, where the guy, with the giant with the hammer is way in the back, and the guy who's hanging is in the foreground, and there's someone on the ground over here, and the camera never cuts. And it kind of just slow. I noticed the cinematography is very slow and still, and so beautifully composed. And it must help the editors because they don't have a lot of work to do because they're kind of just doing all the editing work with the camera. And that's something I noticed lacking a lot in today's cinema. There's not a lot of directors that take the time to really sort of plan out a longer takes like that, where your eyes kind of become, you're the editor yourself in a way, because you can kind of see more and decide where you want to look. And that's just something I really love about this movie and this director in general. I think it's really takes more thoughtfulness to make a movie like that.
I think that's also a function of widescreen, don't you?
Yes, and you shouldn't have started this topic because I could talk for the next 3 hours on it. You're exactly right, because the whole concept of CinemaScope was that it was not, you weren't supposed to have as much editing in it. The whole idea is you'd see it on a 50-foot screen and the audience would be looking in different directions. Yeah. And so you're picking up on that. And today, everybody, even if they're shooting on digital for Netflix, they're shooting often in this widescreen format, but the camera's here and they're showing us things and they're not really getting us a chance to observe an entire scene the way that Korosawa did so brilliantly. But I think you're absolutely right. Every corner of a frame is telling its own story with the characters. I think that's a great observation.
I would like to share that on my note page for this project, there is a sentence at the top in all caps that I wrote, there is a lot of information in each of these widescreen frames. And literally, he's using frames within frames. I think I mentioned that. There is a lot to see in this movie. And I would recommend a second or third viewing, as I really needed to do in order to research my part of the presentation.
Absolutely.
If I can give one of the greatest compliments to Kurosawa's work, and it adds to this gentleman's point, when in New York a couple of years ago, they brought High and Low, his gangster picture, to the IFC Center, and my wife and I and some young friends came along to see it, and my wife commented, "You really have to see this on the screen to appreciate his composition." And that's usually something I'll be saying all the time around the house. But the fact that she realized the way everybody was placed in the shot was so extraordinary. And that's a tribute to his work.
Thank you, Arc 26.
Thank you, Los Angeles.
Thanks for coming out.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Shiver, if you could unmute and start your video. Hi, Howard.
Okay. Yeah, hi. Actually, it's Dahlia.
Oh, hi, Dahlia.
Yeah. Hi,
what happened? I don't see it. Is it gone?
See you.
We can see you. We can hear you.
Okay, so I can see, but it's okay. So I'm not a Korosawa expert, but we saw it last night, and what really grabbed me was the difference between the guy with the gun and Toshiro Mifune. I mean, Toshiro Mifune, the character, the Yojimbo, he's all scrubby and his facial, it's like all hairy and, disheveled. Well, the other guy is almost like immaculate. He has no hair on his face. He's very good, actually somewhat effeminate, I would say. And his robe is also almost, without piece of hair or dirt on it. Okay, so that's one thing. And the end.
Jump in quickly to that brilliant observation. You made me realize Mifune represents the past, and and the man with the gun represents the future. That's just.
And of course, and also the way he holds the gun, nothing like Clint Eastwood or all the Western actors that they hide it in a holster and take it out like in the. He just holds it like, beware, beware, I'm going to do something with it, which is really kind of funny, like almost like in a duel or something. Anyway, but the end is really, really, I think that's one of the messages of this movie, that it's the time are changing, you know? And instead of sword, from now on, it's going to be guns. And I guess the character Yojimbo, Sanjuro, right? He knows that. He doesn't even know how to open to see if there are bullets there, you know? And so anyway, I thought that was very interesting and indicative.
That's a great observation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really.
The next up is Patricia. Patricia, could you unmute yourself and start your video?
Yeah, I'm not going to start my video, but I joined the discussion late, and I'm sorry about that. But I really wanted to mention the humor. If you've already talked about that, then I'm just going to let you know how much I enjoyed it. And I assume that you did bring it up. It just broke the tension. And one of my favorite humorous parts is in the very beginning, where Sanjuro overhears I can't remember which character it is, but they're plotting against him. They're not plotting against him. They're saying, we'll pay him $30 or 30 whatever, and then we'll kill him, and then we'll get all our money back. And you've got the women in the background who are looking at Sanjuro, and he sticks his tongue out. I just thought that was really hilarious. I don't know if anyone remembers that.
Yes.
I had to play that part back to make sure I saw that correctly. Yes.
Oh, it's so funny. He's such an interesting character. That's the thing. I mean, he's so interesting to watch, all his moods and plans, for what he's going to do. But yeah, the humor, there was a lot of it.
From some of the lines to the little bits that you mentioned, and just some of the characters, like the villain who bites his lip and all that.
Well, like when the showdown happened, when he did anything, I mean, that was hilarious. Nobody wanted to fight neither group wanted to fight each other because they didn't have him. So they didn't do anything. Yeah.
But thank you for mentioning that little wonderfully.
That is so, yeah, that's very funny part.
They almost do a dance like the Jets and the Sharks at one point.
Right.
This way and go back, and
I mean, the big showdown actually it's a choreography where the two sides are creeping towards each other, stepping and then stepping and stepping. It's all magnificently framed and like a dance sequence.
One of our viewers here wanted to know how World War II impacted Korosawa.
Oof. Well, I mean, very much so.
We can talk about that all afternoon too.
But I mean, in a nutshell, he joins the Japanese film industry in the late 30s. He's writing screenplays in the early 40s for the film industry. He has to write propaganda pictures. I mean, no matter where you're working in what film industry, you have to write propaganda. And so he writes wartime propaganda films for the Japanese industry that have to reflect a lot of the ideologies of the Ministry of Information. And then, of course, the horrific atomic bombing of Japan influences Korosawa as an artist. In 10 years after, he's going to make a film with Mifune called I Live in Fear, Record of a Living Being, which deals with an older man who lives in fear of a nuclear war destroying Japan. So, and that issue never left Korosawa. So he definitely was impacted. And he didn't like having to parrot the party line during the war, but you didn't have a lot of choices when you were in those situations, because he politically was considerably to the left of the Japanese political leadership.
Any other questions?
I have a tiny bit of trivia, and then Gary has a line that he has to share with us.
Oh, yes.
But I noticed when we see the group of women who are being basically kept as prostitutes at one point, very briefly you see an actress that for me was familiar. 2 years later, when Kurosawa made High and Low, and I urge everyone to see that film if they haven't.
One of his greats.
Greats. That actress appears as a drug dealer in a bar scene where the kidnapper goes and he's looking to make a connection, and they're dancing together, and they make a money drug exchange, and she's the woman who does that. But you see her earlier here as used as a prostitute.
Well, Kurosawa homages appear in many different forms and formats in movies. One of the more unlikely ones that I know of is in the James Bond film GoldenEye, in which the American actor Joe Don Baker, who at that time was frequently playing a CIA agent in a couple of different Bond pictures, and or a rogue agent of some kind or another. And towards the end of the film, he encounters Pierce Brosnan after the action climax, and he calls out to him, "Yo, Jimbo," which was the 007 homage to one of the great action directors of all time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We don't seem to have any more questions. I just wanted to share a slide with you all real quick. We have the Global Peace Film Festival coming up. I'm the manager of the live portion of it. And we are also going to be having a virtual presence this year, the second week from September 27th to October 3rd. And with the code GNPC, you get a 20% discount off of your ticket price. So please join us for Global Peace Film Festival. And if I can, I've been involved for many years. And I think the thing I love about Global Peace Film Festival is that most of the filmmakers didn't start out as filmmakers. They started out as people with a cause, and film was the medium that they found to spread the word. And with the democratization of the internet now, it's just a great way to just find out what's going on in the world and sort of be a little more socially conscious about the world. So please join us. And now I will throw it to Sean Moore.
Okay. Great. Hi, everybody. Again, thanks for the great discussion, everyone. And it's fun to see Dan and Lori jumping in there as well. And so we just love that we are definitely a community of film lovers and continue to expand the family. It's a great thing. I just want to remind everyone, Max mentioned the next film craft session, which is on Tuesday, September 21st, and the technique of film acting. And I think that's going to be a really good one. If you can join us for that, you can sign up for just that single session. And then we've got the next series is going to be so much fun. We're focusing on science fiction, and we have our good friend Stephen C. Smith is back for that. And so he's going to have a lecture on September 22nd, Hollywood and sci-fi. And then the whole gang's going to be here on Sunday, the 26th, for the day the Earth stood still. And it's the 70th anniversary of the day the Earth stood still. So I think that's going to be a lot of fun. I hope that you can join us, and we hope to see you again. Thanks so much, everyone.
Still's also been on TV a lot on like cable stations. So if you want to look at like Turner Classic Movies, it's been on a lot, just saying. So
great. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your Sunday, and thanks for joining New Plaza Cinema.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.